The brass casing from my brother's custom AR-15 hit the dirt, the ringing steel target echoing his arrogant smirk. "Girls don't belong here, Chloe," he sneered, handing me a rifle that weighed more than his fragile ego. He thought he'd already won. He had no idea what I'd brought to the firing line. To understand how we ended up on that sun-baked, wind-scoured ridge at the Copperhead Tactical Range in Nevada, you have to understand the dynamic of the Bennett household. In our family, military service wasn't just a tradition, it was a religion. My father, Richard Bennett, spent 22 years in the Army, doing tours in Desert Storm and early OEF. When he retired, he cast a massive, khaki-colored shadow over the dining room table. My older brother, Wyatt, was supposed to be the chosen one. He was the high school quarterback, the homecoming king, the guy who could strip an M1911 pistol, blindfolded by the time he was 14. When Wyatt enlisted in the Marine Corps right out of high school, my father threw a block party that lasted 3 days. Wyatt was going to be recon. He was going to be a hero. But reality has a funny way of checking your ego at the door. Wyatt washed out of the Reconnaissance Training and Assessment Program, RTAP, after blowing out his knee. He finished his 4-year contract as a motor transport mechanic, an honorable job, but to a guy with a god complex, it was a devastating blow to his pride. When he got out, he overcompensated. He bought a massive lifted truck, grew out a tactical beard, and spent his weekends dressed in pristine Crye precision camouflage, shooting $5,000 rifles at stationary paper targets. He became what the actual combat arms community calls a tactical bro, all the gear, none of the grit. Then, there was me. I was the quiet one, the girl who ran cross-country, read military history books in the corner, and never asked for a dime or a compliment. When I told my family I was enlisting in the Army as an 11B infantry, Wyatt laughed so hard he spilled his beer. When the combat exclusion policy was lifted, I saw my window, and I took it. "They're just trying to hit a diversity quota, Chloe," Wyatt had said at the dinner table, wiping tears of amusement from his eyes. "You're 5'6" and you weigh 130 pounds soaking wet. You'll snap like a twig under an 80-pound ruck. But hey, I'm sure they'll lower the standards so they can put you on a recruitment poster." My dad hadn't said much. He just stirred his coffee, looking at me with a mixture of quiet concern and skeptical curiosity. I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I just packed my bags for Fort Moore, Georgia. For the next 4 years, I didn't just survive. I thrived. I embraced the suck. I let the blistering heat of Georgia summers, the freezing rain, and the bone-crushing weight of the rucksack forge me into something unbreakable. I didn't stop at infantry. I volunteered for the U.S. Army Sniper Course. 7 weeks of absolute hell. Sleep deprivation, grueling stalks through tick-infested swamps in a stifling ghillie suit, and the unrelenting pressure of math-heavy ballistics tests. I learned to calculate spindrift, Coriolis effect, and barometric pressure drops while running on 2 hours of sleep. I graduated in the top 10% of my class. I earned the coveted sniper identifier. When I came home on leave as Specialist Chloe Bennett, 82nd Airborne Division, I thought the dynamic would shift. I thought I had finally earned my seat at the table. I was wrong. My first night back, Dad hosted a barbecue. Wyatt was there, holding court with a couple of his civilian shooting buddies, Trent and Logan. They were drinking craft IPAs and bragging about their sub-MOA groupings at the local indoor range. "So, Chloe," Wyatt called out across the patio, making sure everyone was listening. "Heard you got your little sniper patch? What's the female standard for that nowadays? Do they let you use a rest for the fitness test? Or did you just flutter your eyelashes at the instructors?" The patio went dead silent. Trent and Logan shifted uncomfortably, though smirks played on their lips. My dad stopped flipping the burgers, his jaw tight. He looked at Wyatt, then at me, waiting to see if I'd shatter. I took a slow sip of my water. "The standards are the standards, Wyatt. Same physical fitness test. Same marksmanship qualifications. Same stocks." Wyatt snorted, shaking his head as if I were a child telling a fairy tale. "Sure they are. Look, I'm not saying you didn't work hard, kiddo. I'm just saying the military is softer now. It's all politics, DEI hires. If they put you on a real firing line with real shooters, you'd fold." "Is that a fact?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. It's biology, Chloe, Wyatt said, leaning forward, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of the confrontation. You don't have the upper body strength to manage the recoil of a real magnum caliber, and you don't have the stress management for high-stakes shots. It's not your fault. Girls just don't belong in the sniper hide. I set my glass down. The ice clinked against the sides. Tomorrow. Copperhead Tactical. First one to drop a cold bore shot at 1,000 yards wins. Wyatt's eyebrows shot up. Copperhead Tactical was a legendary private range, known for its unforgiving desert crosswinds and steep elevation changes. It wasn't a pristine, climate-controlled bubble. It was raw, dusty, and difficult. You're serious? Wyatt laughed. You want to go head-to-head with me? I shoot 3 times a week, Chloe. I have a custom 6.5 Creedmoor built by precision gunsmiths in Idaho. What are you going to bring? Your little issue M4? I'll bring my own rifle, I said. If I win, you shut your mouth about my service, my gender, and my qualifications. Forever. You refer to me as Specialist Bennett, and you admit you were wrong in front of Dad. Wyatt's smirk hardened into a predatory grin. And if I win, you go on my Instagram Live, to my 4,000 followers, and you admit that the Army lowered the standards for you to pass. Wyatt, that's enough, my dad finally interjected, his voice carrying that old command authority. No, Dad, I said, my eyes locked on my brother. I accept. The next morning, the Nevada sun was already baking the desert floor into a cracked, white-hot skillet by 9 a.m. The air smelled of sagebrush, scorched earth, and the sharp chemical tang of Hoppe's No. 9 gun solvent. Copperhead Tactical was massive, carved directly into a natural canyon. The long-distance ridge sat on an elevated plateau, looking out over a valley littered with white steel gongs, ranging from 400 all the way out to 1,500 yards. Wyatt drove us up in his oversized truck, his buddies Trent and Logan riding in the back. My dad rode shotgun, his face an unreadable mask. I sat in the back, quietly reviewing my dope data on previous engagement book. When we got to the firing line, the crusty old rangemaster, a retired Marine Master Sergeant named Sullivan, came out to check our credentials. He took one look at Wyatt's pristine, unblemished tactical gear and rolled his eyes so subtly I was the only one who caught it. Then, Sullivan looked at my faded, sweat-stained deployment boots and the battered Pelican case I hauled out of the truck bed. He gave me a slow, respectful nod. Wyatt set up his shooting mat. It was an elaborate affair, complete with a specialized rear squeeze bag, an electronic weather station, a kestrel, and a ballistic calculator running on his iPad. He unzipped his case to reveal his pride and joy. A heavily modified, suppressed 6.5 Creedmoor bolt-action rifle, painted in a custom urban camouflage pattern. The optic alone cost more than my first car. I unlatched my battered case. Inside rested my personal rifle, a stock Remington 700 SPS Tactical in .308 Winchester. It wasn't fancy. The bluing was worn around the bolt handle, and the stock was wrapped in a few layers of olive drab sniper tape to build up the cheek riser. It was a heavy, unforgiving caliber compared to the flat-shooting 6.5 Creedmoor, and my scope was a reliable, but basic, Leupold Mark IV. It was the civilian equivalent of the M24 sniper weapon system I had trained on. I knew its quirks, its trigger reset, and its ballistics better than I knew my own heartbeat. "Cute gun," Wyatt said, glancing over. "You going to be able to hit anything past 500 yards with that dropping like a rock?" "We'll see," I replied evenly, laying out my frayed canvas shooting mat. "All right, rules of engagement," Wyatt announced loudly, making sure Trent, Logan, and my dad were gathered around. Even Sullivan leaned against a wooden barricade to watch. We walk it out. 400 yards, 600 yards, 800 yards, then the grand finale at 1,000. You miss, you get one follow-up shot. But the 1,000-yard target? That's cold. No sighters. One shot, winner takes all. You miss, you lose. We both hit. Closest to the center bullseye wins. Clear? "Clear," I said. Wyatt went first. He settled behind his rifle, going through a theatrical pre-shot routine. He checked his iPad, checked his wind meter, dialed his turrets, and racked the bolt. Smack. The 400-yard steel rang out. Smack. The 600-yard steel followed seconds later. Wyatt was a good shooter. I had never denied that. He had the fundamentals down, but he relied heavily on his technology. He let the iPad do the math. He let the 6.5 Creedmoor cartridge, which cuts through the wind like a laser, do the heavy lifting. At 800 yards, the canyon wind started to pick up. I could see the mirage waves rippling aggressively through the spotting scope, indicating a full-value crosswind coming from the left at about 12 miles per hour. Wyatt fired. A puff of dust exploded off to the right of the 800-yard gong. He missed. "Damn wind," he muttered, quickly working the bolt. He checked his iPad again, made a hasty holdover, and fired his follow-up. Smack. He hit the right edge of the plate. Barely. He stood up, brushing a speck of dust off his knee. "Your turn, little sister. Try not to embarrass the family." I got down behind my rifle. The familiar smell of the canvas mat and the cold steel of the bolt grounded me. I didn't have an iPad. I had my dope book, my eyes, and my training. I looked at the dry desert grass near the targets. I watched the dust kick up. I read the mirage. I ran the math in my head. Target distance 400. Elevation 2.5 MOA. Wind negligible at this distance. I squeezed the trigger. The heavy recoil of the 308 pushed into my shoulder. Smack. Center mass. I racked the bolt, moving seamlessly to the 600-yard target. Smack. Dead center. I shifted my hips, aligning my natural point of aim for the 800-yard target. The wind was tricky here. The canyon funneled the breeze, making it swirl. I calculated the 12 miles per hour's crosswind. With a 308, the wind drift is severe. I dialed 3.5 MOA of left windage into my turret. I controlled my breathing. Inhale, exhale, pause. At the natural respiratory pause, the crosshairs floated perfectly over the white steel. Break the shot. Smack. "Holy crap," Trent whispered from behind me. I stood up, clearing the chamber and leaving the bolt open. I looked at Wyatt. His smirk had vanished, replaced by a tight, rigid line. My dad was nodding slowly, a gleam of genuine pride in his eyes. "All right," Wyatt snapped, his voice losing its playful edge. "Any monkey can hit 800 if they get lucky with the wind gusts. But 1,000 yards is a different zip code, and the wind is picking up." He was right. The canyon was heating up, creating updrafts, and the crosswind was now aggressively whipping the sagebrush. Hitting a 20-inch steel plate at 1,000 yards with a 308 under these conditions was a masterclass in ballistics. Wyatt walked over to his rifle for the final shot, but before he laid down, he pulled out his phone and hit record, propping it up on an ammo can. "Hey, Instagram," Wyatt said to the camera, putting on his best operator voice. "Out here at Copperhead. About to drop a 1,000-yard cold bore shot. My little sister is here, fresh out of the army. We're doing a little test of the new inclusive military standards." I felt my blood boil, but I forced my heart rate down. Anger makes your hands shake. Anger makes you miss. Wyatt got behind his rifle. He spent 3 full minutes consulting his weather meter and iPad. He dialed his scope. He settled in. Boom. Through my spotting scope, I watched the bullet trace. It was a beautiful shot, cutting through the wind. Smack. The bullet struck the 1,000-yard plate. It wasn't dead center. It was low and left, about 5 inches from the edge, but it was a hit. A solid, undeniable hit. Trent and Logan erupted into cheers. Wyatt stood up, pumping his fist, looking like he had just won the Super Bowl. He walked over to the camera. "That's how it's done, folks. Precision. Science. Manpower." Then he turned to me. He picked up his rifle, cleared it, and walked over, holding it out to me. "Tell you what, Chloe," Wyatt said loudly, ensuring the camera captured every word. "I'm a fair guy. I know that old 308 you brought is basically a musket. I know it doesn't have the ballistic coefficient to fight this wind at 1,000 yards. So I'll let you use my rifle. I'll even leave the windage and elevation dialed in for you. All you have to do is pull the trigger." If you can't hit it with my setup, then you admit on camera that you girls don't belong here. I looked at his space-age rifle, then at his smug, expectant face. He was setting a trap. If I used his rifle and hit, he'd claim it was his gun, his math, and his dope that did the work. If I used his rifle and missed, I proved his point. But there was a third option, something I noticed when he was showing off for his camera. "No thanks, Wyatt," I said, stepping past his outstretched arms and dropping to my mat behind my battered Remington 700. "Keep your toys. I'll stick to my musket." Wyatt scoffed, moving his phone so it was pointed directly at me. "Suit yourself. Get ready to make your apology speech, specialist." I closed my eyes, tuning out his voice, tuning out Trent and Logan's snickering. The only thing that mattered now was the math, the wind, and the glass. I settled onto the frayed canvas of my shooting mat, the heavy barrel of the Remington 700 pointing downrange toward a target that looked no larger than a grain of salt against the vast, dusty canvas of the Nevada desert. Wyatt stood over me, his phone angled down, capturing every second of what he assumed would be my spectacular failure. Trent and Logan were chuckling, their shadows stretching across my peripheral vision. I tuned them out. I tuned out the heat radiating off the baked dirt. I tuned out the stinging, dismissive tone my brother had used his entire life to keep me in my place. Right now, the only reality was the math, the glass, and the wind. Hitting 1,000 yards with a 6.5 Creedmoor like Wyatt's was a matter of basic competence. The cartridge flew flat, fast, and defied the wind. Hitting 1,000 yards with an issue standard, 308 Winchester was an entirely different beast. At around 850 yards, a standard 175-grain Sierra Match King bullet drops below the speed of sound. It enters the transonic zone, where the disruption in sound waves causes the bullet to wobble, losing its gyroscopic stability. To make this shot, I didn't just need to be accurate, I needed to predict chaos. I glued my eye to the Leupold Mark IV optic, dialing the magnification up. The glass was scratched on the outer housing from a rough airborne jump at Fort Moore, but the lenses were pristine. I began my scan, completely ignoring the Kestrel weather meter Wyatt had offered me. That was the mistake the tactical bros always made. Wyatt had taken a wind reading right here at the firing line and let his iPad spit out a sterile algorithm. But a canyon isn't a wind tunnel, it's a living, breathing topographical nightmare. I looked at the vegetation downrange. At 400 yards, the dry sagebrush was completely still, dead, calm. At 600 yards, the heat mirage, the visible distortion of the air, was boiling straight up from the earth like steam from a kettle. Still no wind. But at 800 yards, the canyon walls narrowed. I watched the dust being kicked up by a swirling thermal draft. The mirage here was tilted at a sharp, 45-degree angle, tearing aggressively from right to left. Then I looked at the 1,000-yard plate. The wind down there wasn't blowing right to left at all. The topography of the ridge created an eddy, a localized vacuum that caught the crosswind and folded it back on itself. The dust directly behind the final steel plate was drifting left to right at roughly 4 miles per hour. Wyatt had shot low and left. He had shot low because his iPad didn't account for the sudden drop in barometric pressure as the morning sun heated the canyon floor, thinning the air and altering the bullet's drag coefficient. He had shot left because he had dialed his windage for a right-to-left wind that simply did not exist at the target. He fought a ghost, and the ghost won. I pulled my dope book from my cargo pocket. My handwriting was tiny, crammed into columns of data recorded in rain, snow, and suffocating humidity. I found my 1,000-yard data for this specific altitude and temperature. I reached up and gripped the heavy elevation turret of my scope. Click, click, click. I dialed a massive 39.5 MOA minutes of angle into the optic. I was practically aiming at the clouds to drop the bullet onto the steel. Next, the wind. I ignored the roaring crosswind at 800 yards. I trusted the calm at the target. I dialed exactly 1.5 MOA of right windage to counteract the slight left-to-right drift at the terminus of the bullet's flight path. "You're taking too long, Chloe," Wyatt taunted from above, his voice amplified for his live stream. "The wind is picking up. You're just letting it get into your head." I didn't answer. I adjusted my body position, aligning my spine straight behind the rifle to absorb the heavy recoil symmetrically. I pressed my cheek into the olive drab tape of the stock. The sight picture settled perfectly. I racked the bolt backward, exposing the chamber, and pushed a single, brass-cased, 308 cartridge forward. The locking lug slid into place with a satisfying metallic clack. I closed my eyes for 2 seconds. I lowered my heart rate. I felt the pulse in my neck slow down. Inhale, the crosshairs rose above the target. Exhale, the crosshairs descended, floating dead center over the painted white steel. I reached the natural respiratory pause, that split second of absolute stillness at the bottom of a breath. I applied 3 pounds of steady, straight backward pressure to the trigger. Boom. The rifle kicked hard into my shoulder pocket, lifting the muzzle slightly. Because I was perfectly aligned, the rifle settled instantly right back onto the target. Through the glass, I watched the violent disruption of the air, the bullet trace, as the heavy projectile arced into the Nevada sky. 1 second passed. The bullet hit the 800-yard mark, scrubbing speed, dropping below the sound barrier. 1.5 seconds. Smack. It wasn't a dull thud. It was the sharp, undeniable ringing crack of a direct impact on AR-500 steel. For a moment, the only sound on the ridge was the echoing vibration of the metal, bouncing off the canyon walls and fading into the hot desert air. Then, the crusty rangemaster, Sullivan, who had been peering through an oversized spotting scope the entire time, stood up straight. He didn't look at me. He looked directly at Wyatt. "Center punch," Sullivan announced, his gravelly voice cutting through the silence like a knife. Dead in the painted bullseye. Not an inch high, not an inch low. Trent let out a low whistle. Logan took a step back, suddenly finding his boots very interesting. Wyatt froze. The phone in his hand, still broadcasting live to his thousands of followers, dipped toward the dirt. "No," he stammered, stepping forward and grabbing his own spotting scope. "No way! That's $100 barrel shooting surplus ammunition. The wind out there is pushing 15 miles an hour. She had to have thrown a flyer that just happened to walk on target." I calmly worked the bolt, ejecting the spent brass casing. It flipped into the air and landed with a soft clink next to my mat. I engaged the safety, stood up, and brushed the dust off my knees. "I didn't throw anything, Wyatt," I said, my voice steady, carrying none of the arrogance he had displayed. "You missed the center because you let a microchip read the wind for you. You read the wind at the muzzle. You didn't read the canyon. The wind at 800 yards was pushing left, but the canyon wall creates a back eddy at the target plate. It shifts right. You fought a wind that wasn't there." Wyatt stared at me, his mouth opening and closing silently. He looked back through his glass, tracing the topography, realizing exactly what I had just explained. His face flushed a deep, mottled red. "And for the record," Sullivan chimed in, walking over with a grim smile on his weathered face. "Carlos Hathcock made his legendary shots reading the grass and the mirage, just like she did. A good sniper doesn't need an iPad. A good sniper needs a brain. Your sister just gave you a masterclass, son." Wyatt lowered his phone. He looked completely unmoored, like a man who had just realized the foundation of his entire identity was made of sand. All the expensive gear, all the bravado, all the swagger, it had just been dismantled by a girl with a stock rifle and a notebook. Then, my dad stepped forward. He had been silent the entire morning. He walked past Wyatt, not even glancing at his pristine camouflage or his $6,000 rifle setup. He walked straight up to me. For the first time since I had enlisted, he didn't look at me like his fragile little daughter. He didn't look at me with concern or skepticism. He stood at the position of attention, squaring his shoulders, and looked at me like a soldier. "That," my dad said, his voice thick with emotion, "was the finest piece of fieldcraft I have ever seen. Outstanding shot, Specialist Bennett." A knot I didn't know I had been carrying in my chest for 4 years suddenly untied itself. "Thank you, Sergeant Major," I replied, acknowledging his old rank, a sign of mutual, hard-earned respect. Dad turned slowly to Wyatt. "Turn the camera back to your face, Wyatt." "Dad, come on!" Wyatt started to protest, shrinking under our father's gaze. "Turn the camera around," Dad ordered, his tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. It was the voice that had commanded battalions. Wyatt swallowed hard. His hands shook slightly as he flipped the camera lens back to himself. "Now," my dad said quietly, "you made a bet. Pay your debts." Wyatt stared into the lens of his phone. The thousands of people watching live were waiting. He looked at Trent and Logan, but they immediately looked away, offering no support. He was entirely alone on his self-made pedestal. Wyatt cleared his throat, his face burning. "I just got outshot. Badly. By my sister." He swallowed his pride, choking on it all the way down. She didn't use any tech. She didn't have an advantage. She used skill. The military didn't lower any standards for her. I was wrong. Specialist Bennett earned her place on the firing line. He reached over and abruptly ended the live stream, shoving his phone into his pocket. The silence returned, heavier this time. I didn't gloat. I didn't cheer. I knelt down, snapped my dope book shut, and carefully placed my Remington back into its battered Pelican case. Infantry training teaches you a lot of things, but mostly, it teaches you quiet professionalism. You do your job, you hit your target, and you go home. I locked the case and picked it up by the handle, the weight of the rifle comforting against my side. I walked past Wyatt, stopping just for a second to look him dead in the eye. "Gear doesn't make the soldier, Wyatt," I said softly, so only he could hear. "And gender doesn't pull the trigger, discipline does." I walked back toward the truck, leaving the golden boy standing in the dust, entirely eclipsed by the shadow he had tried so desperately to keep me under. The desert wind howled through the canyon, but for the first time in my life, it sounded exactly like applause. If you found yourself holding your breath during that final 1,000-yard shot, hit that like button right now. Chloe's story proves that true grit and discipline will always outshine arrogance and expensive gear. Do you think Wyatt finally learned his lesson, or is his ego too bruised to heal? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Don't forget to share this story with someone who loves a good underdog victory, and subscribe for more intense, real-life drama.